Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I'm happy that you're taking some time from your valuable life to join me. I'm continuing on a series that we started a couple months ago. Nicole Sackage and I started a series on art and UFOs. Earlier in my career, I did a book on music and UFOs. There seemed to be a very direct connection between musicians and the UFO subject. And then we discovered that there was also this connection to art. I have another artist to me tonight, and his name is Douglas Taylor, and he has beautiful art. He's absolutely stunning. You can see some of the art in the background when he comes on the screen. He's going to do a share screen, and he's going to go through some of the art, and we're going to sort of talk about what the connection is to UFOs and art, where he sees the UFO subject, why he got involved in all this. So, good evening, Doug, and thank you for joining me on this art series because you're one of the people I really wanted to talk to. I met you first at Consciousness Life Expo. So, to start, can you sort of talk about your background, how you got into art, how you got into the music, the UFO subject, and then explain to people what Consciousness Life Expo is, because that's, I think, probably the biggest event in the country. Am I right?
It's one of the biggest. They get probably 15,000 people there. But there's some of the other expos that they have, like Comic Con, stuff like that,
Oh
that's a
yeah, yeah.
little different in what they're really trying to produce, so to speak. And they might be quite a bit bigger. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a large one for what it is.
And
And
that's
yes,
in
thank you
LA.
so much.
Yeah, yeah, and you have a table there at the conference, and Serena, your wife runs the UFO segment of the expo, and I met you, and then we you actually bought your book, so I'll sort of promote your book. Have you got more than one book? This is the
That's my only book, and I'm down to my last, I think, 20 copies.
Wow. So this is your
So
book, and it has your art in it. And I met you there. We had a conversation. You were in the hall there, and there's a lot of artists that I saw. A lot of art there. A lot of people with tables on various healing modalities and stuff like that. So I found it very very interesting, and that's at the Hilton in L.A. So maybe go through your background and how you got into art, because I don't think you started early on. I think you started sort of in midlife with art, and then how did the UFO thing come about?
yeah, it's kind of interesting because I never really was an artist as I was growing up as a child. I didn't really have a rapport with that aspect of being creative or even having the desire to try to, produce some sort of art. And I did enjoy surfing, so surfing was kind of my connection to nature and to the sense that I was part of something larger than myself.
I will
And
say, I will say, you do look like a surfer.
well, you know what? I'm actually an old surfer now. I'm not going to go into that part of it, but I still love it. I think I've experienced such joy, such incredible, uh, just a sense of calm. It really helped to kind of mellow out my anxiety syndromes in different ways because it's giving you that physical exercise. It's also allowing you to experience the natural environment of an area that is just so beautiful. When you look at a really glassy wave when there's no wind, it just creates this sparkly, beautiful environment. And when you're out there paddling around, you feel like you're floating. So a lot of my real, I guess you could call it psychic experiences, or my original experiences that kind of got me motivated towards learning more about consciousness and the mind and what it really was I got into yoga when I was probably about 16, 15. I read Autobiography of a Yogi by Yogananda, which is, most people have heard of that book. And it was fascinating to me, mainly because it encapsulated or incorporated the science of consciousness into it in a way that I hadn't really ever read about before. Everybody knows religions have their influences on our populations to a really extreme degree. And I'm not going to say that's good or bad. It's just for each
Yeah.
person, it's going to be what's right for them. But for me, the science and the spirituality needed to have some sort of point where they could merge together before things started making sense to me. And so I began having experiences where I would actually, in dream state, I would be able to leave my body and be, what people call a dream where you can actually be aware of the fact that you're dreaming.
Like a lucid dream.
Yeah, like a
Yeah.
lucid dream. And so, it's a very fascinating experience because you're experiencing everything you're experiencing when you're in your physical body with all of your perceptions and
Yeah.
your senses functioning. But now you are laying on the bed, your body is completely inert, and yet your mind is giving you a sense of reality that is still extremely real.
Wow.
So I began having experiences that seemed more real to a great extent in my dream states than they seemed when I was in my waking state.
Wow.
And so, there was a certain kind of evolution of developing my ability to be able to kind of leave my body um, when I was in sleep state. And so I didn't find that it was kind of a lot of stuff that I had been reading in books by Sylvan Muldoon, I think was one of them, and I'm sure I forgot his name right. But he had a lot of stuff about out of body experiences and what to do. So make a long story short, I found out for sure that my physical body wasn't the true me. So there was a part of me that existed beyond this physical body. What it was or how it existed, I had no clue at that point in time. Okay, jump forward a little bit to 1977. I'm going on a surf trip into the Caribbean islands. And as I'm coming back in from a beautiful, beautiful day surfing, and this is a beautiful environment. And if anybody's been to Puerto Rico, they know that, well, the SETI, the giant telescope there, um, Arecibo
Yeah.
finally crunched. Hopefully they're going to put it back together.
Yeah.
But anyway, the island itself has this energy. And I felt it when I was there for the first time. I was like 25. And it was so powerful, and I was just surfing, having a fantastic time. And one day I came in from surfing after, just a beautiful day, just feeling so calm and so relaxed. And I let myself kind of drop off to sleep. And before I was completely asleep, I felt my consciousness start to kind of spin in a sense of being like a function of pure energy. In other words, I just felt that my consciousness was being spun in a way that um, I was just like an energy. And this pure energy, all of a sudden, experience went on for just a few seconds. And then as my mind began to clear, I was staring at these seven beings
Wow.
inside what I assumed to be a starship.
Wow.
And I was blown away, not just because of what I was seeing and because of, the fact that I had never really had an experience anything close to this before, but it was the emotion or the sense of upliftment that I felt. In other words, the frequency that I'm normally functioning in is on a certain level that is very, I would call it on an animalistic level, of your perceptions. You get hungry, you go to sleep, you do what you got to do to survive. This was something completely different where all of a sudden I was just so totally uh, transcended into a different level of consciousness than I'd ever experienced. And so I began to, first of all, looking at the individuals who were staring at me, they were all just glowing. They had this incredible, there were seven of them standing in front of me, and they had this beautiful glow, and they were kind of looking at me like they could see right through me, and I
Yeah.
felt like there was an intuitive connection, but it was almost like I was receiving some sort of a download of information, not directly from that experience, but something that I had known before. You know what I mean? It was like there was an intuitive sense that this was something that was going to have a tremendous impact in my life. And it did, because as the experience went on, all of a sudden, I was just asking them simple questions like, you know, do you bring people into your craft? Is this something that you do typically? Is this, I was just asking them different questions, and they all only contacted me. They only talked to me telepathically. So there was this telepathic conversation going on, which I'd never experienced. And they said, yeah, this is something we do from time to time to help people to kind of get connected, to give them a charge of that positive energy so that they can kind of lift themselves up and get going on their own spiritual trajectory. I mean, that's basically what I got out of it. And so as the experience went on, all of a sudden, the individual, I actually have a little um, video that I made of it that I'll show later so you can kind of see a little bit more of what's
Okay.
happening. But anyway, the individual who I'd been talking to, I assume was a captain, mentally
Yeah.
communicating with, he was in this white suit, and he motioned over to this beautiful, beautiful lady that was standing next to him. And as he motioned over to her, and she just kind of looked at me with the most compassionate but very intense gaze, and I felt these beams. It wasn't like I seen them, but I felt these beams of energy just projected right into my consciousness, and I was lifted up to the highest level I'd ever experienced up to that time in my life.
Wow.
And as that experience continued for only a few moments, and but a lot happened. It was like a healing in a sense, is what I began to understand later, from a lot of the debris and just all of the stuff you pick up in
Yeah.
your normal material environment of hate and the negative aspects of life.
Yeah.
And that I'd just been kind of projected into this little bit more positive level of consciousness. And I go, whoa, can I go with you? Can I go with you? It was like, that was the only thing that came into my mind. I simply did not want to go back, even though I was having a great time in Puerto
Yeah.
Rico surfing. That's all I was doing. But I just wanted to go with him because that feeling was something that I'll never, ever forget. I've experienced it many times after that in different ways. But they said, no, you're not ready to go with us. So after that, all of a sudden, I awoke laying on my bed, and I almost didn't feel like I had even been asleep, but everything was absolutely crystal clear in my mind of everything that had taken place. And my roommate, who was hanging out in the same house, we were living in this house in Puerto Rico, I immediately began telling him about it, and he blew his mind. He couldn't figure out
Yeah.
what the heck was going on, because it was one of those, experiences that is more real than reality. In
Wow.
other words, you're put into a position to where you're connected to a greater part of the universe than you had ever really experienced before. So it's almost like you don't have anything to compare it to, but it's definitely, a highlight of your life. So that's basically what it was.
So these were human type beings, and you said you had other encounters. Has it always been the same beings that you encountered?
Well, these were definitely human type beings. And the experiences I've had since then have been slightly different in that it wasn't necessarily going on to a UFO. It was
Okay.
more like what started taking place is I would find myself in these classrooms when I was asleep, and I'd be very aware of the fact that I was becoming much more capable of accessing my psychic abilities. I was becoming much more, I guess, in tune with that spiritual aspect of myself. And so I would find myself in classrooms where somebody would be teaching me different aspects of things that, how to release myself from certain blockages that I have that are kind of holding me back in this lifetime. And
Wow.
that I came to understand that this is really the main purpose for me coming into this physical body in this lifetime, was to slough off the negative lower frequencies that I've accumulated. And again, this is another aspect of it that's so critical over a period of many lifetimes. So in all of those different lifetimes, those frequencies that have been oscillated through my consciousness as experiences have created a specific frequency that I'm functioning on. And so many of those had to do with very negative past lives, having to do with killing people, having to do with being a pirate. It goes on and on and on. All the ones that I was even one of the people that helped to um, basically put Socrates on the death list, at
Wow.
that time. So, you'd say, well, how do you know? How can you really get into something that involved? But it's really a matter of feeling the healing energies as you release yourself from what is just a lot of guilt, a lot of negative blockages,
Yeah.
and they're just waveforms that exist in your psychic body that you've created. They don't have a good or bad purpose. They're just what you are, but you can go back. And this is like the most important factor that I've come to understand since my trip aboard the ship was that this education was what I really needed in order to begin to develop a higher and more positive relationship, not only with my higher self, but with my creative self. So it was only about 2 weeks after I came back from the trip in the Caribbean, having never drawn or painted, maybe just a little bit in school, but
Yeah.
never having caught on to it at all. I began to draw spaceships and draw waves. And within about 2 years, I was actually doing paintings. And when I would be in tune with that energy, at times it would be so powerful. I felt like I was like doing something that must be illegal. That's what it felt like. It was like somebody's going to arrest me if they know what's going on right now. Because it was just such a beautiful, beautiful feeling of freedom. And so that energy would just come through and I would start painting. And it started out pretty crude and I was never happy with what I was able to uh, kind of produce in the beginning. And then as I continued with it, I became more in with the flow and also learning more about how art works and how, the different aspects of establishing the actual elements of art and the properties of becoming an artist, painting and all of the different aspects involved in color and brushes and all that stuff. It became something that became a tremendous enjoyable education for me. So it's one of those things where a lot of times, when you first begin something, you kind of go, too hard, don't want to do it, don't want to
Yeah.
continue. But I had such this incredible upliftment when I would do it that it kept me going, even if I didn't like what I ended up producing. And so that's really what kept me at it, is the fact that there was this beautiful, beautiful sense that I was like a radio transceiver. And I think this is something that I've learned in that whole process since the educational process took place, and that I can receive and I can transmit information. And what I receive is based upon what I am drawing from. What am I tuning the channel of my receptor or my receiver into? Am I
Wow.
tuning it into the low negative aspects of anger and fear and anxiety? Or am I tuning into something that is futuristic and that most people would call, science fiction? But any kind of science fiction, as we've kind of seen from the way that the science fiction from 100 years ago now is, Captain Cook would take out his little,
Yeah.
looked kind of like a cell phone to me. So Captain Kirk
Yeah.
on Star Trek. So there's a lot of elements that go back deep into the past where futuristically minded individuals were tapping into what basically they had already, in a sense, seen, because they're going in these dream states or in the states in between their physical lives to the spiritual worlds. And so they've come back to bring this information in, so to share it so other people can then become aligned with that intelligence.
Now, you mentioned, and I didn't know this part of your story, that you had started drawing 2 weeks later. You probably know that that's pretty common. If you know Akiana Kermark, are you familiar with this painter? She's about 25 years old now. She had this
Ah,
experience at 5 years old where she disappears from the house, and she follows this ball that has this godly presence through the universe, and she splits into 1,000 fragments with 1,000 eyes, and she can see everything. And she's the one that painted the famous picture of Jesus at 8 years old. This
oh, I think I remember seeing that. Yeah,
Yeah, you can look her
actually,
up. Akiana Kramark. She has that thing where she has starts this painting, this unbelievable talent to paint at 6 or 7 years old.
yeah, right,
And Chris Bledsoe had the same thing. If you know that experiencer, he had his awakening experience. He went running off to the art store and he started buying paints and stuff like that. He'd never painted before. And the other one that comes to mind is Emily Trim, who was in the aerial school situation in Rhodesia. These little kids, she has a
all
second
right, right.
experience. She lives in Canada. She had a second experience in Hamilton, and the beings came. This is about maybe 5 6 years ago. Same thing. She started to paint. Just went out and got paints. So, do you think that the painting is part of? Well, first of all, do you think that you have an agreement with these beings, or is it that they picked up on your vibration, or did you have an agreement before life that they were going to come and that this is part of your message, like your art is part of what you're to bring to the world that has a message in it that people need to know about?
Yeah, I think there's kind of an abstract connotation there, when you start talking about being connected with the entire universe, where you can feel, because we're made up of these atoms. We identify ourselves with this physical body, but we have really no control over these atoms other than what we do. So we're like little energy solar systems with trillions and trillions of them doing their thing. And so, in a sense, we're connected to this greater force, which you could call it the infinite creative intelligence, whatever you want to call it. And so that's producing, an infinite number of dimensions and worlds and levels of consciousness that we can begin to tune into and learn how they exist and how we can live there by understanding how the people who live there have been able to educate themselves to that higher frequency. So that's kind of more of what I've kind of come to understand it as. But back to your question, the actual thing that I think was the most key for me is that beginning to understand that there is this specific education of learning and being able to accept the various negative aspects of your personality, that your own ego consciousness, your identity, that which you identify as you, is very, very compacted into this little world of all of the various senses and emotions that you experience when you're trying to just be in this survival mode, which we normally are in this world. And so when we leave this physical body, depending on where our minds are at, we then are opened up to this vast, unlimited intelligence that we are also a part of. But when we're in these physical bodies, we really can't access it. But we do come into these physical bodies, in my understanding, specifically to work out and slough off the negative elements. And this is a continuation as higher and higher and higher as you go. You're always raising your frequency. I mean, one person's floor is another person's ceiling. One person's ceiling is another person's floor. So it kind of goes into that, I think, to a great extent. So my experiences have been to the extent that I've seen, really what I would call monstrous parts of myself that I had created through fear. And one of them was when my mother died when I was young. This is a real happened in this lifetime.
Yeah.
And I remember I was just terrified. I was so afraid because I heard her screams of horror, for
Yeah.
about 3 or 4 years while she was dying of cancer. And I was in the next room and I was like 10 years old. Okay, so there was just this engulfing blackness that just kind of, I had these big circles around my
Yeah.
eyes when I was going to, it was
Yeah.
really, I was really connected to that negative experience and all the negative energy that was associated with it. And then when I finally was able to begin to comprehend and understand it and break it down into its component parts of understanding, okay, this is the fear that I had, and this is what I created. On the other side, in my dream states, I began having these incredible healings that I couldn't even describe, where I would wake up. I feel like I wasn't even floating. I mean, I feel like I wasn't even touching the ground. I would be
Yeah.
floating sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks. I was so uplifted with it. And it
Wow.
was just being released from those negative aspects of my own fears that I had created for myself. and facing them. I could get into some of the different ones, but there was monsters. You create your Frankenstein monster, you create it, and then it comes and it tries to destroy you because it's connected to you and your thoughts.
Oh,
And so I've come to understand that there are these other dimensions that exist that are on a much lower plane that we don't normally see, but those are the lower, what you call lower astral worlds, or whatever you want to call it. But that's where all of these obsessional factors exist. And if you can begin to release yourself from those obsessions through understanding where they're coming from, mostly through your own fears, then you begin to raise your consciousness, and then you begin to feel the desire to be creative and to express that creative side of yourself, which I started doing obviously 45 years ago, and I'm still at it. I mean, I'm a finished carpenter. That's what I do really to
yeah.
make a living. I'd like to make a living off of art, but if it doesn't happen in this lifetime, it doesn't happen. I sell my art from time to time, but it's not, I wouldn't quit my day job. But so it's really just been an experience that has in every way given me a connective uh, connection, I guess you could say, to this greater uh, consciousness of what I am, of who I am, and how I can tune into these more creative aspects of my own personality that I never knew existed. Because I was blocked off from them. That's what I'm trying to kind of focus on, the fact that as these blocks were removed, I felt this
Wow.
energy of being just totally dislodged from an anchor that was holding me down underwater where I couldn't breathe. And then all of a sudden I would just be lifted up. Not that they didn't continue. There's a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
stuff in there. Most people have lived a lot of, been around a long time. So yeah, so that's been the main aspect for me. And other people may not have the same amount of blocks and
Yeah.
the history that I have. And so they're going to come in and they're going to immediately be able to connect up with their creative side. They set it up because they've had lives where they've been creative in the past. They've already developed that understanding of how to connect. So it's not so much dabbing the paint on the canvas, it's tuning in to the channelship that you can be and allow yourself to then express that channel through the artwork so that other people are uplifted when they see it. So that's the main purpose.
And what's the role of the beings in terms of art? Because you see this connection between artists and the UFO subject. Are they here to help you with these blockages to elevate you, or what? Like people always say, like why would they be so altruistic, and what's their intention, and all this kind of stuff. So how do you fit the UFO into the art? Is it because a lot of people may think that like artists are very right brained, their ego is sort of somewhat shut off, and they're able to attune to higher realms, whereas if you're into the physical world and the ego and making money and stuff like that, you sort of shut yourself off. So what do you think the relationship between art and UFOs is?
Yeah, I think it's the same aspect of you have to go by the individual. It's so easy to lump everybody into, a specific group of people and say, okay, everything is like this. Everybody is totally different. I mean,
Yeah.
even, you know, from the standpoint of the molecular construction and chemical construction of our bodies, everybody has different things that are helpful to them and that aren't helpful to them or whatever. So I think everybody's experience is going to be based on their past experiences because that's what we're re-expressing. And there are all kinds of people that are going to have, maybe negative experiences. I've heard of plenty of those. And it could specifically be individuals who they've been aligned with in the past who don't have their own best purposes in mind. But the individuals that I've been associated with, they've never forced anything on me. They've never, it was always my decision to make that connection. And if I didn't make that connection, if I didn't make that decision, then hey, you know what? They could just cut you loose, because it's almost like on Star Trek, where they have the primal directive, the prime directive,
Yeah.
where if they were to come in and influence us,
Yeah.
what happens is you're always expecting somebody to come in and help save you. You know, it's like if an angel
Yeah.
comes in and relieves you of something and you don't have to do anything to understand how it happened, then when you get in that same situation again, where you're just in dire straits, you're going to expect that. And all that does is make for a weaker and weaker individual. In other words, what I understand is these individuals are trying to um, help us to become strong in our connection with our spiritual self the way they are. And they know they can't do that for us.
Yeah. But the question would be then, why does Doug get to interact with beings? And people say, why can't I have a being? Is there a connection? Is there a soul contract between you and them on a sort of a past life where you've agreed to work together? Or why do you have the experience as opposed to 99% of the people who don't have the experience?
Yeah, I think again, it just depends on each person's past experiences, but it's more than that. It's also the fact that, you know, I was totally interested in this
Yeah.
information, from when I was very young. I used to watch
Yeah.
Star Trek when it first came out, the very first one. Sit in front of the TV and watch every one, I was just fascinated with it. And what I began to realize was that, you know, I didn't have any special tendencies that was going to give me a connection to that. I had a rapport with it. I was interested in it and I was open to it, but it really came about because of the fact that, like you said, I had set up in this lifetime that I'm in right now, before I came into this physical body, to connect with these individuals.
Okay.
It's kind of like your intuition. I remember when it first began, I would be walking around in the library in Huntington Beach where I live, and I would just find books, that were just like began with Seth Speaks, I think. If you remember that one, I don't know if
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
anybody
yeah.
remembers that.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah. Yeah.
drinking a beer, smoking a cigarette, and she's
And
channeling.
channeling away.
And the whole thing is kind of, pretty hilarious. But so for me, I finally found books that, were really, really stimulating my mind. And I was going, God, I want this to be proven to me. I can't, how can I get this proven that this is real, that this experience, that this psychic body actually exists?
Okay.
And so that was what happened, is that it was validated and proven to me in a way that shocked me to the deepest levels of my being.
Yeah.
Almost, how it's kind of like one of those things where you say, well, you better watch out what you wish for, because when you finally get it, you may not want it. Because it
Yeah.
was a very
Yeah.
terrifying thing, and it's still, it puts you in a position where you kind of have to be more focused on making sure you keep your consciousness at a certain positive level. Not that I do, but I try.
Yeah. Well, that's the sort of the expression. I think Edgar Casey said, "Knowledge not used to sin," or the Bible says, "To whom much is given, much is expected." That if you're suddenly in this, you have the onus. You can't really say when you die, "Well, I really didn't know. I was, you actually knew what was going on." And it comes down to what do you do with what you've been given.
I'll be honest with you. There were times when I wanted somebody to have some sort of device that they could take these experiences out of my head, because they were just too mind-boggling to me.
Yeah.
But eventually, as time goes on, some of the intense, I guess you would say, the focus of some of these cycles, when a cycle is really at a peak point, incredible things are happening and they almost seem like overwhelming. And then as you go on through those cycles, you begin to digest the information. And so it's not so disruptive to your normal state of mind. Because it was hard for me just to
Yeah.
function in
Yeah.
the world, kind of going, wait a minute, what the hell did I just experience there last night? I mean,
Yeah.
what is going on here?
Beautiful.
So that's the thing that I think was the most amazing, was that once I finally it validated itself for me that it was all true, that we do have this spiritual body that is functioning on another level, that's recreating our physical body.
Yeah.
It was like, it was a mind-boggling thing, and it was wonderful,
Wow.
because I wanted to know so bad, but like I said, sometimes you got to watch out what you wish for.
Exactly. Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint, and you can set it
Yeah.
up, take over the screen. And I guess my first question to you, from all your art I've seen, is the color. It's almost like psychedelic. It's like different colors than you've ever seen. You have a lot to do with color in your paintings, and that may be my first question. Is that
Yeah, I
sounds
think, can you see my screen now?
yeah, you got to enlarge the
Yeah, I'm gonna put it in right now. I
yeah,
just want
put
to
it
make
full
sure you have it.
screen and then
Got a
okay.
music here in the beginning. Can you still hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so these are the individuals that I saw,
Okay.
and the individual on the left in the front was, I assume, the captain. He communicated with me, motioned to
Wow.
this lady, and she just beamed me with this energy that I had never experienced before. And it was so, so powerful. And these are the individuals. I mean, this is burned into my memory banks like you can't
Wow.
believe because it was so powerful. And so these are some of my more recent paintings because I've become familiar with the fact that to me, I haven't ever met any aliens that, I love the whole idea that there would be tremendous diversity. I've gotten totally into the whole exoplanet because I've always been into astronomy and I find it so fascinating. But the beings that I've actually, I guess you could say, have been in contact with have never been anything other than human-like,
Yep.
only much, much more, I would say, higher in their frequency. They seem to radiate this light and this intelligence that
Yeah.
just goes out to everybody.
Yeah.
So this is
And
kind of,
are these things that you see in your vision that if like from other planets, or where are these images coming from?
it's not an image so much that I see. It's
Yeah.
something that just kind of uh, creates itself. You know how it's like creativity. You think about it, the universe is constantly recreating every single atom in our body. I mean, these things are being creative all the time. Everything is being recreated. Where from? That's kind of what the interesting aspect of it is. So as you delve into being creative and being able to try to connect with something that is actually on a more higher level of connection for your own consciousness, then it kind of develops. And sometimes I find I need to edit them as I go along. I'll just kind of go, wait a minute, I need to do this, I need to do that. But sometimes they just come out just the way they are. I'll show you one that was that way that kind of blew my mind.
And you have a
These are
lot of
some of
water.
my,
Most of yours have water because you have this association with the ocean.
I love the ocean. And it's interesting because, most of the scientists, astronomers right now are talking about the fact that, you know, if a planet isn't in the right spot where it has water flowing the way that our water flows, isn't frozen, isn't
Yeah.
burned off, then that's where life can develop.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, I believe that's true. But there's frequencies that are no longer in our physical dimension. There are structures that are no longer what we would consider atomic. And so they exist on a frequency that we can't see. So we have to be able to, it's kind of like the television. When you turn it on, you're seeing this picture. Where's it coming from? Same thing. You have to be able to tune your mind to where you can pick up on a little bit more, uh, what you would call a science fiction picture, but something that's a little bit more futuristic. And that's a reality somewhere.
Yeah.
And this is one I call Temple City, which is again along those same lines where individuals are going out specifically to help to spiritualize or help to find planetary dwellers who need help or in ways that they can educate and help them, just like what happened with me. I really feel that that's an absolute valid truth.
Have you gotten any visions of other planets, like in terms of like the buildings there? Because sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Crystal City out in outer space, where they've been to the Crystal City and stuff like that. Have you had any visions of
Well,
buildings that?
if you look at most of my paintings, I'm always trying to depict the crystal in nature, because that's absolutely true and valid. All of these higher dimensions, it's actually a mind force that the individuals are recreating knowingly. In other words, they're actually aware of the fact that they're recreating their environment because they have developed a consciousness capable of encompassing that vast awareness of themselves as a very, very connected spiritual being. So there's no ego there. The
Yeah.
smaller ego would only, cut off that energy. So it has to be a identification with a much larger field of intelligence. And with that, then they can begin to connect with, these dimensions and create these crystalline cities from their own mind energies. And so they
And why
maintain it.
why crystal? Is it like a, because you see a lot of that at like Cosmic
Well,
Life Expo or Odyssey.
I think that's the way that we would identify with it. To
Yeah.
me, it's almost like a liquid light. I try to
Yeah.
depict it a lot of paintings. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be probably the fact that it's just a much higher frequency
Okay.
material than the
Okay.
normal atomic structure. Now, this is something where I'm trying to show how, if you look on the right side of the screen, my
Yeah.
right, I'm not sure what it would be
Yeah.
for you guys,
Yeah.
is the psychic body. So that's the
Okay.
energy body, the spiritual body that is recreating the physical body through all these different waveforms. So that physical body is really just an amalgamation of the psychic body. So when you physically you disconnect, you die, that spiritual body carries on all of the experiences that you've had. And so that basically continues the continuity of, whether or not you've been able to make progress in this life, or
Yeah.
whether you need to come back and try to work out some other stuff. And again, this is just my depicting something that had actually taken place in Popocatépetl down in Mexico some years ago, where people had been seeing the different craft going in and out of the volcanoes,
Volcano. Wow.
which is pretty amazing when you think about it, because it gets pretty hot in there.
No
It's
kidding.
like they're in a different frequency. So heat and cold, that wouldn't really be relative to them in these ships, because they're functioning in a frequency that isn't relative to it. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what I felt when I was in the ship. It's just like I'm no longer really, well, I wasn't in my physical body, obviously, but it was something where I was in a sense of something that wasn't going to be relative to the physical dimension in the way that I normally would be.
So let me ask you a question on that. Like you, and I was going to ask you before when you were talking about being on the ship. So what's your interpretation of the sort of the abduction experience? Is it a physical body that's being taken, or is it the sort of the astral body or the etheric body that's being moved onto the ship? Because a lot of people will say, has anybody ever seen anybody actually be taken? And I have a friend by the name of Ron Johnson who talks quite often about the fact that he's actually taken into the spirit world by these beings, where it's doesn't seem to be a physical thing, where it's it's not your physical body that's being taken. And I think you're describing the same thing, where you're sort of sleeping, and suddenly your etheric body or whatever is on the ship.
Yeah, I think that as far as somebody describing themselves being taken up, I think they with abductions with the grays, they talk about, and this could very well be true. I'm sure it is for them, and I'm not going to put anybody else's experiences into my judgmental belief
Yeah.
system, because I know that anything is possible. But for me, I see it as when you enter one of their ships, you can't go in your physical body. These higher, these
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
more spiritual,
Okay.
evolved ships, you couldn't go into it in your physical body, because it's a completely opposite energy. It's a different frequency, so it wouldn't really be allowed. So when you go in, I mean, you could walk in your physical body, but you're going to instantly be transformed into that higher, more spiritual frequency.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not that you can't go in
Yeah.
physically, but in a sense, it almost could be something that would be a negative thing for you. You could burn yourself mentally, because
Yeah.
you wouldn't be able to really understand the frequency of that higher dimension. So they can help you to kind of adapt to that. And then
Could
that's kind of our purpose here, is to adapt so that when we do finally move on, we're moving on to a higher level of consciousness, and we're not stuck in the same old mud pit.
you could see the sort of the glow around them? Could you feel the vibration? Could you feel that they vibrated differently, or that they were, because they look
Oh
physical, but
yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. That's the thing that it's hard to
yeah, it's hard to describe.
explain or
Yeah.
describe, because it's something where your very being is no longer functioning on the same, what you would call your animalistic level. I relate it to the sense of survival, where everybody's trying to survive, especially now with the pandemic going,
Yeah.
it's crazy what's going on. People are finding themselves not having enough food to eat or whatever. So on that level, that is an important factor in the evolution of our species to be able to maintain that sense of survival. But how about survival after death?
Yeah.
That's the next step. So that's kind of more of what I'm trying to learn how to do and learn the process of how I can do that.
And you're talking about these events where you're being trained. What is that kind of environment? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about being trained on a ship or as children and stuff. Where's that training sort of taking place in terms of?
I think a lot of times it could be on a ship, but most of the time you're probably being taken to another planet
Okay.
that is on a much higher frequency or on a higher frequency. And you're in classrooms, which I've seen myself hundreds and hundreds of times. Serena has experiences like this too that she could talk
Yeah.
about, my wife.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're not so much learning about, the 3 R's,
Yeah. Yeah.
reading,
Yeah. Exactly.
arithmetic. What you're learning is how to align yourself with your spiritual nature in a more direct way. So, in order to do that, the number one thing that I've learned is you have to release yourself or let go of those negative frequencies, they're little like dark energy vortexes that are in that psychic body that I was showing that's just
Yeah.
pure energy. There's still those negative little frequencies in there that are, creating all kinds of havoc from being able to function in a more positive way. So then you have to come back in the same dimension, which would be a physical dimension in which they were incurred, in which you originally created them. I've seen myself actually slit somebody's throat when I was a pirate. It was the
Wow.
most, and the way that it was shown to me, it was like I felt the frequency of that, which
Yeah.
I couldn't describe, but it was so horrible. It's like scratching your nails down the chalkboard
Wow.
times a million. I mean, that's the frequency that went into my consciousness. And so that's a very negative vortex of energy that I can only free myself of or only heal myself. I'm talking about healing myself, but I'm also talking,
Yeah.
there's a tremendous amount of help coming from these different brotherhoods that exist. They function moving through different worlds, through different planetary systems as space travelers, and they also function as much more developed spiritual beings who don't even have any association with physical bodies anymore, but they're all kind of connected.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful.
So these are some of my newer ones where I'm trying to do the
Wow.
exoplanets in a way that, kind of brings in the just the reality of what life could be like on some of these other worlds, and the beauty of
Again,
it.
again, you have this incredible color in your paintings. How long does it take for a painting like this to do? What do you? Which time do you
Well,
spend on it?
actually, sometimes I just lately it seems like for the last maybe 3 or 4 years, I don't work on them very much. I'll work on something for a little while. I've become kind of what do they call it when somebody OCD? I've become very OCD, obsessive compulsive
Yeah.
disorder. So if I do something and it just looks the slightest bit out of whack with what I was trying to accomplish,
Yeah.
I just get rid of it and I start over. So I go real slow. But if you're doing a painting like this, it would take me maybe as far as hours of actual painting, you could do it in probably 24 hours. That'd be probably
Okay.
about a week.
Wow.
So, it depends on the size too, the amount of paint that you're putting on. So it's something that I like to really take my time now, just
Wow.
because it's, I don't know, it just seems to be, maybe I'm not so in tune anymore, but anyway. And of course, a lot of the stuff that I have these intuitive experiences with, it's like kind of like what you said, this vision will come to me, but I don't know what the vision is. In this
Okay.
case, it's relative to a history that I'm familiar with that I believe actually existed, which was when Atlantis finally went down. There was a group of very advanced spiritual beings who had created a submarine type craft that was able to make it over to the over to Egypt, over the African continent, and they actually started the Egyptian civilization, Isis and Osiris. They were two of the most advanced teachers in Atlantis. And so then they began this civilization in Egypt. So that's kind of, a little bit about what this is depicting, where there was also still connections from these different space star systems and the advanced star travelers helping people to develop. But so many of these civilizations have gone the way of, the great fall. And if you really look at it, it's kind of part of the cycles of the way evolution works, but it's also the choices that people make is more of the fact. And once people start going against the teachers and not being able to recognize that the teachers are really the ones who you should be listening to and learning from, then the ego begins to take over, and all of a sudden you get basically the destructive side comes in. And so Egypt and that whole civilization of Isis and Osiris has left a lot of different little, hints here and there about Isis and Osiris, but the true history I don't think is really known very well. And this is one that's just kind of I don't know. I just love putting the relationship of how these galaxies, as we're beginning to understand now, are formed of billions and billions and billions of stars, and each one of those stars, they are now discovering, more than likely has at least one planet. In some
Yeah.
cases, many more planets than one. So it's kind of a unique factor that the evolution of our astronomy, making better and better telescopes, being able to see, what's out there, in a sense, actually becoming to the point where now they can use a spectrometer and see the atmospheres on these planets when they look at the sun and the little dot of the planet, which is very dark. They can actually pick up the spectrometer from the atmosphere, and they can tell what is in the atmosphere, whether it has oxygen,
Yeah.
methane, whether there's water vapor. And so that's just the beginning. It's not any different than, not a thousand years ago, we thought the earth was the center of the universe.
Yeah.
So you think about where we're
Yeah.
at now. I mean, 100 years ago, we had no idea that there was any other galaxies. And, Hubble finally was able to break that myth. And so these myths just keep getting broken down. What is established science now,
Yeah.
science fact, in the future, it gets thrown out because a new development comes in. And so that's the way evolution works. And so I think it's going to happen in a much more, that's my actual take on the way that the so-called understanding of life as it exists on other worlds kind of has to take place in a slow fashion so that people can kind of adjust to it. And one of the ways of disclosure, the way I see it, is that we develop telescopes, we develop methodologies. First of all, being able to say, hey, we can see the atmosphere on that planet and it looks just like Earth. We know there's life there. And then eventually, the people come around, and then it wouldn't be such a shock for somebody to land their ship here and say, hey, we have some really fantastic information if you guys want to learn. And, majority of the people are so based in religious beliefs that, they'd think it was the devil or whatever, So you got to take these things very slowly. You don't want to overshock people because it can create a worse situation than you already had.
The question on that, because you talk about discovering other star systems. What about the other aspect of the UFO phenomena in terms of the fact that people have to come to understand that you have a spiritual body and that the ego has to be sort of put aside, and that would lead to the question of what do you see? Are we going to make it? Because you see the world is very divided. Ego is at the front of everything. It's me. It's like we spell team now. I. Where do you think that we're going to be able to get over that hump? Because it's one thing to say, okay, there's aliens out there in other star systems, and then when you hear the message, because I say, sometimes if you hear the message that you got or that people, the spiritual message, people really don't want to hear that. I'm busy making a living. Don't give me that kind of stuff. So do you see the world surviving, or do you see us going like Atlantis, or what do you
Well,
think is going
that
to happen?
attitude is kind of why we're here. It's like If
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
all you think exists is this physical world, then you're not going to ever be aware of anything else. It won't just happen for you. You know, it has to be
Yeah.
something that you're striving to understand more. And I don't think that this world is going to destroy itself, but if it did, it wouldn't surprise me. It's happened many times in the
Yeah.
past. And we'll just go to the last one here. Well, this is actually what I would depict as a more spiritual world where people no longer have to function in physical bodies, where
Wow.
they actually live in this spiritual state of consciousness that is so evolved and so developed that we can't really even begin to comprehend the fact that they're recreating the environment that they're living in through their own thoughts and through the beauty and the majesty of the consciousness that they have evolved into
Yeah.
and have developed through hard work, through the process of being able to understand how those principles of spiritual evolution actually function. And they're utilizing them.
Wow. Do you,
So here's
oh,
a more crystalline effect that I
yeah,
like.
that's beautiful.
That's the thing about the waves that always blew my mind was that I would go out and I would see these crystal effects in the water, and it just tuned me into something. I don't know what it was at the time, and I believe I know a little bit better now that it reminded me of this liquid light that exists in these more evolved spiritual worlds, that where you're functioning in such a beautiful state of mind that it's pretty impossible to really be aware of it unless you're in it. And then it on this world, it only lasts for a fleeting second, and then you're back in your physical awareness, and you kind of, was that a dream? Did that really happen?
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of it. Now this is the last one. So this is my depiction of Return to Atlantis,
Wow.
which shows my belief that that civilization actually exists. There was this huge golden temple, and in this temple, these beings who were the much more evolved beings coming from other spiritual dimensions, other planets, mostly from the Pleiades, although that term is kind of a generic term, I guess you could say, for individuals who are more who would look like us, but who also have a much more developed spiritual awareness, and that they actually were able to come in and educate the people that were on the earth at that time and develop a civilization that eventually became so paradisical that it was just beyond belief, and that individuals inside these temples would be the most advanced spiritual beings, and you would be able to go. You couldn't really go into the temple unless you were spiritually developed enough to be able to deal with the very super high frequency that was in there. So everybody had their levels, but it wasn't like somebody was better than somebody else. It was just everybody was evolving and very happy to be where they were at, because they were learning and they were growing and had all they needed. There was no want, but eventually
Yeah.
similar things that have happened before, the people began to want to have their ego being the main factor, and they began to fight against what the teachers had developed, and eventually the civilization itself uh, was completely destroyed and sank into the ocean. And that's kind of the history of Atlantis that we don't have in our own particular paleontological or the records of various civilizations, but you can see the buildings are, to what I was attempting to do, is very much more of a crystalline nature and
Yeah.
of a slightly higher frequency.
Wow. You mentioned Serena. Can you sort of go through? Do you?
Well, that's it. I'm going to stop the screen sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Okay, can you see me?
yep. So, do you and Serena still have contact? Are you still sort of on the path and being sort of given guidance and as to what to do?
Absolutely. I think what happens is you'll go through like I said, peak cycles where tremendous amounts of information is kind of brought into your consciousness. And I still have experiences, but they've become more of they're more familiar to me. So it's not it doesn't, in other words, the frequency that I had, say, 40 years ago when I first had that experience in the ship was very, very coarse and very, very, low in comparison to the fact that when you have these experiences, when you have these healings, the very frequency of your psychic anatomy is stepped up because those negative energies are released. So your actual atomic structure of your physical body also responds to that. And it in itself begins to radiate because your psychic body is radiating, through your physical body, so to speak. So you still have the experiences, but they aren't quite so shocking. You're more familiar with them, and you still have to learn some very hard lessons. I mean, the last two jobs I've been on, just to go back to a more material aspect, I quit under very extreme anger. And I'm 67. I'm working as a finished carpenter. The guy pissed me off to no end that I was working for, and I started yelling at him, cussing at him. And then I left and I go, wow, why did I do that? So I mean, there's a learning process always, but I learned from it. You can't help but let some of these things out. It's not like you're supposed to, just sit around in
Yeah,
a
yeah.
meditative pose. You got to live life. You got to experience life. That's how you get back in tune with these different cycles where you can work stuff out.
But it seems to have helped you because you sure don't look 67. That's for certain. For certain.
Yeah. When I'm working, I feel it though, because the old body just, yeah. And I don't really surf very good anymore. I
Have
served
you-
all my life, and I always was, wow, yeah, I'm one of the best guys out here, and now I went out a little while ago, and I just kept falling on my butt every time I'd stand up, and I go, you know what, this is embarrassing. I got to get out of here. I used to know how to do this.
Sort of last question. Can you basically spell out, you've already sort of spelled it out, but if you were to leave a message for the world in terms of what this is all about, why they're here, what we're supposed to be doing, what would you sort of leave with the world in terms of something that would really help people?
We're definitely here to learn about both the past as a means of gaining the lessons that we needed to gain and apply that to the present so that we can not make the same mistakes and develop into a more positive future by applying that new intelligence and that new expansion of our minds and consciousness towards our fellow human beings and realizing that we're all part of this same substance of intelligence, of infinite intelligence, and that when we hurt someone else, you may not, you may think you're getting revenge or whatever, but you're really hurting yourself because we're all connected in that way. So, find a way to connect with your, you know, brothers and sisters as we exist. I know that's kind of a word that they use a lot, but
Yeah.
we are really all brothers and sisters in spirit. And so I would say once we can begin to understand and accept that, all of these different elements begin to come together and our life begins to change and improve.
Wow. Well, I appreciate what you do and the time you spent with me when I was in LA. Do you sell your paintings? You sell prints or do you sell originals? Or because what we're going to
Yeah.
try to do is set up a Facebook site and a website so that people can link into you to buy the stuff. We have nothing to do it, but we just want to set it up because some people do collect this stuff. And I always say that maybe 200 years from now, when people sort of figure out what's actually going on, they're going to say, "Oh man, this is going to be like Van Gogh stuff." It's going to be like, "Wow, these
Oh
people,
yeah, yeah.
they're at the
No,
beginning of this." Yeah,
Van Gogh couldn't sell anything when he was alive. One of his paintings just went for
exactly.
like 92 million. So
Wow.
yeah, I'm really hoping that I live just a few more years because I'm pretty sure my art will be worth something when I'm dead.
Yeah.
So as soon as I'm dead and gone, I hope somebody can, see, hey, this guy's art's great. Let's go
Yeah.
buy it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's not really the point.
Yeah.
As hard as it is to be really enthusiastic about doing art and doing something like this, if you're not actually making money or you're not getting it out there, that's probably more important than making money. But
Yeah.
making money is important because you can't function in this world
Yeah.
unless you make pretty much a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm lucky I had a trade to fall back on as a finished carpenter or as a carpenter from when I was very young. But yeah, it's the same old story. When I'm dead, I'm sure it'll be worth something.
Yeah.
And I do have people who collect my stuff, my art, and
Oh, is that right?
I've sold
Wow.
sold originals. And I've sold quite a few. I have a website, DouglasTaylorVisionaryArt.com,
Okay.
and I also have a Facebook page, which is Doug Art on Facebook. And that has a bunch of my stuff there. So it's all kind of connected to a way that you could purchase it by credit card. It's all set
Good.
up already.
Beautiful. Well, we're going to link all that stuff because the people who watch this are watching all the art ones. And you said you've seen some of the art stuff we've done. So we link it all together, and more people are learning that there's a whole collection of people who are doing this. And I think it'll become more popular. And we'll do whatever we can to support you in terms of what you're doing, because you've got your mission, I've got my mission, and I think that's what it basically comes down to: is you got to figure out why you're here, and don't worry about everybody else. Just worry about what you're supposed to be doing, because when it comes down to it, I think when you leave the world, they just basically ask you how did it work out, because you planned it. It's like Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women are actors, and they have their entrances and exits, and every man plays many roles, and it's up to us that we are here to do what we're supposed to be doing. Sometimes we get sort of hung up on what other people are doing, but we'll
Well,
try
I'm
to
sure
help you
you've
with your
gone
mission.
through, I'm sorry, I'm sure you've gone through your evolution of, you know, kind of
Yeah.
first getting involved in this and then beginning to see that there was a lot more to it than just, somebody seeing a UFO flying through the sky or being abducted or whatever. There's a whole process of information that's accessible to anyone. They just got to kind of go look for it and find it and then utilize it for their own life.
Wow. Thank you, Douglas. And we will be in touch with you. We'll give you the links. We'll give you all the stuff when it goes up. And I appreciate your taking time to share with me. And Conscious Life Expo is a cancel, I guess, this year and going to go next year.
It's actually going to be virtual this year. So
Oh,
the
okay.
Conscious
Okay.
Life Expo, if you go to Conscious Life Expo 2021, you'll
Okay.
see that actually I'm going to be speaking as one of the speakers in there'll be a segment where Serena will be the host, and it has um, Nick Pope, Paulo Harris, Linda Moulton Howe,
Hmm.
me, and I'm not sure if there's anybody else. But then
And what do you,
there's a huge number of things. If you just go to consciouslifeexpo.com, you'll find that there are all the big time speakers that are
yeah.
usually at the actual conference are going to be virtual online.
And what are you speaking on?
I'm speaking on the exoplanets and my
Oh, okay.
experience
Oh, so
trying
you've
to.
actually studied the exoplanets and the research being done on it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not no physicist, but I really love the scientific relationship to it, and how they're beginning to be able to see through the atmospheres of the planets. It's just
Yeah.
fascinating with the newest telescopes. So it's all interesting stuff. I find it fascinating.
Beautiful. Thanks for your time, and let's catch up soon.
Thank you, Cameron, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.